In St. Augustine, Florida, at the end of Diesel Road, is an area where some of the finest production shrimp trawlers ever produced were manufactured. We happened to be riding down the street to take a look at the area and ran into Captain Jenkins, who invited us in to tell us a story of DESCO Marine.
I moved here in the 80s, and the man next door, his name was Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith worked for DESCO Marine, diesel engine sales, ever since it started. He was a master mechanic. He could carve wood, build anything. In fact, I think he built the house and the little garage next door. So I got to know him pretty well. He was quite a gardener too. He was an old-fashioned guy. He had a garden you wouldn't believe. And he used to give me vegetables all the time because I had a well. He didn't have a well. And I'd run a line over there and let him water the crops, and he would give us food and stuff. And I became really good friends with his granddaughter. And her name's Shelley Schmidt. She's still a friend today. In fact, she's in some of these photos. Became real close friends. But he was quite a carpenter. And he passed away, and then Mrs. Smith passed later, and I inherited the house. I bought it. When my mortgage came due, I bought that house, and that's how I ended up owning it. And
well, you're right here, and DESCO Boat Works was literally across the street from your property right here.
That's correct. They had the old kilns. In fact, most of this stuff was here until just 20 years ago. When Luhrs Manufacturing Company bought it, they remodified it so they could build their boats. But in the old days, they had huge wooden sheds over there. They didn't have this big fiberglass shop they have. That's what it was. The big building was where they actually changed from wooden shrimp boats to fiberglass shrimp boats.
And that happened in the late 70s, early 80s, or something like that?
In the 80s, and then mostly, more so in the 90s, they started building large shrimp boats that came out of molds. I think there was 3 different sizes, and the molds were huge. I mean, they were big molds, and they would put it in that fiberglass shop and they'd shoot it, and they'd have barrels of resin, and they would do the underlayment, and then they would form up in the same shops. They would form up. They had a carpenter shop, and they would form up the pieces that made the shrimp boat, the cabin, all the other parts that go to it, and then they assembled it, and like an assembly line, like they would build a car.
So you could say that DESCO pretty much, that they had an assembly line,
more or less,
for building these commercial shrimping boats.
The largest shrimp boat industry in the world. They sold boats to South America, Europe, everywhere.
Well, there was
sold boats everywhere.
The old DESCO saying was, the sun never sets on a DESCO boat.
Probably not.
But just because they were all over the globe. They were in service in so many different areas and different fisheries. Not only shrimping, but I think they modified them for some other type fisheries as well. But the commercial aspect of that boat, and especially for I guess larger corporations, the one that immediately comes to mind for me was Singleton. I think they may have owned over 100 DESCO boats.
In the Keys, I think, weren't they? The Singletons were in the Keys.
They
had their own processing plant, and they called these shrimp, they turned pink because they ate algae that made them a different color, and they called them Key West pinks. Even before they're cooked, they have a little pink hue to them.
I think back in those days, those guys could just pick up the phone and call up and say, "Hey, we need get us another 2."
Yeah.
And the process, from what I've read, is they were turning out boats by the dozen every month.
Yeah, they were very large at one time. At the end, they had a lot of companies that branched off from that. One of them in particular, and the most successful of all, is Caterpillar. They had some diesel engines and stuff, and his name is Randy Greenhaver, and he has a brother who started a business with his inheritance from his dad and created a tremendous It's the largest, I think it's the largest in the world. They make all different types of heavy equipment, and they're famous everywhere. And
I know that
right here in St.
Ringhaver
John's.
family.
Yes, Randy and he had a brother, and they were big in the sports fishing industry when it was growing here, and he had a real nice boat, and they had a lot of tournaments and blue water tournaments, and that became pretty big and very popular.
Their Caterpillar operation, I think, was Ring Power. I think
That's correct.
Is what they call that operation.
That is correct. Now, I don't know, DESCO was diesel engine sales. Now, how that relates to the rest of it, I don't know, but it seemed to have spurned from that or grew from that, from what I understand.
You know, I was thinking about this. You know, you got a guy that's he's got these diesel engines to sell.
Mm-hmm.
There's an industry that's blooming that needs diesel engines.
Yeah.
What better way of promoting and selling your product is to building a vessel that it needs to go in?
Randy is a very intelligent man who could see a vision, and he made it grow. And it's a tremendous business. And they're still here in St. Johns County. He lives here, and he's got a huge place out there. And I think Mr. Ringhaver was one of the biggest financiers of the operation, or supporter of it, to keep it going, and there were some others, of course, that were involved. I know some of the people that worked there. There was Mr. Capt. In fact, back then, people really worked. They worked hard for a living, and failure was not in the vocabulary. And they used to, they were very talented. They could do a lot of things. They had some master carpenters over there that were incredible.
I can see that, you know, in the boat building business. You know, my grandfather used to tell me, you can't use a level on a boat. You got to use a tape measure. Forget about using a level.
Yeah.
And you really start to think about the craftsmanship and skill that's necessary for somebody to really become proficient at what they do.
Absolutely.
And that's a lost art.
Yeah.
You know, it just is not utilized anymore. I don't think. Very small amount of boat building.
When they were building those boats, it was amazing how many different craftsmen it took to build one. You talk about when they were actually building wooden boats and they were laying them up. Of course, they had to build the kiln they had a kiln where they took and molded the wood to make the
ribs and everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, they make the first piece, which is the one they bend, and they boiled the wood. They heated creosote of some sort, and they bent it, and then that was the beginning of the boat. And then they built to that by making the ribs and make it fold out. But there was so many carpenters, and they drilled so many holes and ground so much that the sawdust over there would be 1.5 feet deep. I mean, it was all the way around the boat where they were grinding and drilling and sanding and smoothing it and bending the wood, and then they came in and caulked it. They caulked it. They had some guys that were so talented you wouldn't believe how many times you had to strike a hammer to put that caulking in between. There was like a rope or a hem.
It's some sort of kind of cottony, waxy type material, and they would, with a blunt looking chisel, I've seen that, and they would string it along and kind of pound it in there.
I remember some of those guys must have been very, very talented, or they inherited those skills from their fathers or grandfathers or whatever. It was passed down to them to build boats. That's what they did. And I remember some of them over there. They didn't have a real hammer. It was like a mallet. It was a wooden. It wasn't like a hammer we use today that's made of metal. It was actually made of wood. I guess from hitting it all that, how many times you would have to hold that hammer and swing it to put all that caulking in a rib of boat.
Sure. I can just imagine what it sounded like, you know, being in that would not only, you know, you're not talking about one boat being built. They would have a line of them going.
It was a big deal. There wasn't many industries in St. Augustine. There was some small businesses. There was some construction companies and things like that. But major places we had the VAW, I think, was aluminum process company. We had Fairchild Hiller, which was they actually did airplanes and stuff out there. That was at the airport. And then this was one of the biggest employers that they had.
How many people would you think, did they have out there?
I can't tell you about DESCO, but I can tell you about Luhrs. Okay, when Warren Luhrs, the brothers, came here, and they brought their industry here, it was a perfect, ideal place for them to build boats. And they built the Luhrs boats and Luhrs, and they built a racing sailboat. I forget the name of it. My memory's not very good. I've been through a lot of therapy, and this medication has destroyed my memory, or I can tell you a lot more. Anyway, make a long story, I didn't mean to get into all that, but when they started here, when I bought in 1980, when they started over here, that was 23 years ago, I guess, something like that. Oh, 43.
Yeah.
43 years, didn't get my math right. When they started, there was approximately 400 employees manufacturing boats for Luhrs. And a Luhrs was one of them, which was a island hopper looking kind of boat. And then he was famous for racing sailboat. He was like a designer, engineer or something, but there was 400 people working over there. I had friends that even actually worked over there. One of them, a real close and dear friend, had passed away, but he was even on the board, and he was their maintenance facility guy.
I wonder if any of those DESCO folks made the transition from DESCO boat building to the Luhrs operation.
Possibly some. I wouldn't think a whole lot because the process is so different. They
Very
were
different.
doing nothing but fiberglass, and now of course they got a cabinet shop. They do woodwork and all that, and they built the pieces and components for the boats. And they built some pretty nice boats. Those big sports fishing boats were pretty nice. And that island hopper boat I'm talking about, there were some of those that were, and they made different sizes. And some of those boats were just fabulous. I mean, they did a good job. They knew what they were doing.
I was on the other side of the river this morning on Riberia Street, and going by the commercial docks, and there's one old DESCO. He's Captain Trey. That old boat is sitting over there, and it's in disrepair, but it's a fiberglass hull. It's a fiberglass boat. And what's just really crazy to me is all those vessels that were built, and believe me, there were thousands of commercial trawlers built here in St. Augustine. There's one over at the dock.
Oh, yeah. Well, the shrimping industry is a dying industry. It died quite some time ago. Like I said, when my dad and all my uncles were doing it, we moved all over the place. We went to Brownsville, Texas, Morgan City, Louisiana, and then we would go up the coast, up to the Carolinas, Savannah, out of Savannah, and all that. You followed the shrimp. There was they migrated and moved like most species do. And
right.
They would follow them, and back in the old days, they didn't sell shrimp by the box. You hear about a box of shrimp weighs 100 pounds. They sold shrimp by the barrel, and that was in the Gulf. The oil industry really appreciated them catching all the shrimp because there was so many shrimp that they would clog up all their filters and their vent. They were trying to cool the equipment with seawater, and they would get clogged up. There was so many shrimp. They'd get stuck in it and clog it up, and they had to keep cleaning the screens so they could cool their equipment so they could keep drilling for oil. So when they started the shrimping industry over there, it was a pleasure for them to get some boats out there and try to reduce the amount of shrimp that were actually out there. Shrimp or seafood at that particular time was dirt cheap. It didn't cost much, and you could catch tons of it very easily. It didn't take a big boat. In fact, the old shrimp boats weren't very big. Most of them were like 26, 27 foot, 28
right,
foot.
Yeah.
They weren't big boats like that they started manufacturing here. I know that one of DESCO's biggest boats was a 73. And if you had it, that was bad to the bone because that was a big shrimp boat. It was quite a boat. And with a big cabin on it, and it could sleep 4 or 5 guys, and had huge fuel tanks on it. It had the ability to go for days and weeks at a time. And of course, when they started inventing the saltwater ice machines and they're doing IQF stuff now, they could have caught a lot more shrimp because they had to actually, when we went shrimping, we had to bring a load of ice with us each and every time. And we had to split the bins to put the ice in it so that the boat sat right. because ice is heavy, water's heavy, you couldn't just fill up one side. So what you would do is the front boxes, the way we did it, was fill up the bins in the front, leave the back ones empty, and as you caught the shrimp, you would put a layer of ice and you would balance it. And you would put it all in there until you were done.
There's a big discussion today about the quality of ice boats, which there's still quite a few ice boats running. But the big production guys, those are all freezer boats now. But the quality of ice versus frozen, because those shrimp are blast frozen, and they preserve them. But then there's a lot of old school thought that says an ice boat, if he comes in and unloads on a regular basis, you can't beat the quality of those.
Right. And IQF shrimp have a lot of chemicals. They use a lot of benzonates or preservatives and things, which is really not good for human consumption. When I do buy IQF shrimp, I wash them extremely well, maybe 3 or 4 times. It's very important. There's 2 different processes that they use. One of them's more dangerous than the other. And I like dealing with Jack's Mayport because they use the lesser of the 2 evils. So we do well with that. There was the ice, actually in St. Augustine, there was 2 or 3 ice plants, and they were very successful. And as a matter of fact, right across the street, the road that goes down the end here, of course all that's gone now with what they're building now, but it was called Ice Plant Road. And there was actually an ice plant there that manufactured ice. And they had the machine that could grind it and crush it and blow it into the boat. That's where we used to go, and they would hand you the tube. And I remember
down there and
I was a teenager. I was very young, and I remember down there hanging on that hose. And when that ice comes, you better be hanging on. So yeah, it would kick because it was the machine going like that, and it would shoot and fill the bins up as it went. And they were huge blocks of ice. They actually dropped into that machine that ground it up because that's how they. That they chilled big blocks. That's how they froze the ice. It wasn't like they have today with like an ice machine itself that makes small cubes. This thing makes nothing but block ice, and you have to grind it up to put it in there. So
you're talking about this property and your time here. The DESCO yard, they were kind of waning out, I guess, of manufacturing when you acquired.
They had all ended. By the time I bought this property, it was over, let's see, I think in the 70s it came to a halt. It's probably in that book right there, but it'd be more accurate than what I can tell you. I'm just telling you what I know from memory.
Right,
Memory's left. Anyway, make a long story short, when I got here, DESCO had closed. There was nothing going on across the street. It was just an empty parking lot. Where you see that pond right now, retention pond, that was nothing but a parking lot. And then there was these huge buildings behind it. And they were big buildings. So, big enough for a shrimp boat that's on a rail.
Yeah, I can imagine.
To roll down to the water, it's got to be pretty good size. And of course you want to build it out of the weather. You couldn't build it outside. I mean, the weather would hinder you so much with rain and storms.
Yeah, you got to keep those guys.
Sure,
you got to keep those guys dry.
Right. So anyway, there were some huge buildings. Well, it's unique. It's historical, actually, because it's a thing that happened here in this country that would never happen again. They're never going to have a manufacturing of shrimp boats like that ever again. And at one time, they did a pretty good job of giving the industry what they needed, quality fishing vessels.
In an efficient manner.
Yeah. And they had, the Facios owned a big shrimp boat called the Breadwinner, and it was built here. And the Salvadors, if you docked, you had to deal with him. You sold your fish to him and your shrimp to him. And he had connections up in New York and stuff. I remember him loading tractor trailers, and they would, when shrimping was good, boy, he was sending loads and loads up north to those people who needed seafood, fresh seafood, and he did pretty well for himself. And both those docks are no longer there. That shrimp boat is tied to Salvador's dock right there. If you'll look in the background, you'll see the bridge that's still there.
Oh, yeah.
See the column?
Yeah.
When you drive across King Street, I don't know if you're from here or not.
Yeah. Well, I'm not from here, but I know.
Okay, but that's the bridge right there. That's the bridge.
No kidding.
And so we had that shrimp boat for a while. I worked on it when I was a kid in the shrimping industry, and things were tough. You know, I got salt water in my blood, but I didn't want to be a commercial fisherman.
Yeah.
There was too many downtime, weather problems. You know, when NOAA says it's 4 to 6 foot seas, you stayed home. You can't, but you still have a mortgage payment.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming
at
the end of the month.
You still got a boat payment. You still got to pay for the maintenance and the fuel and the nets and all the things that go with it. It was a hard industry. There's no doubt. The ones that made it were pretty smart. Singleton was pretty smart. He would get captains, I mean people that knew how to fish, to take over one of the boats. And what you do is like sharecropping. He takes part of the catch until you get to where you could actually afford to branch out and actually purchase the vessel.
Yeah.
So DESCO sold a lot of boats to those guys that did that. And he didn't own, you know, hundreds of boats and stuff, but those captains did. And they worked for him and then fed he had a huge place down there, from what I understand, down in Key West. And it's one of the biggest.
Yeah, they were pioneers in the seafood industry,
yes,
no doubt. In this
absolutely.
country. Well, hey, Captain Jenkins, I got to tell you, I have this has been an unbelievable experience for me, just kind of cruising down Diesel Street and wanting to get a look at the old place here and running into a guy that's got some living history. And we certainly appreciate your time and coming on the channel here with us today.
No problem.
Thank you. And
take care.
Man, you be safe out there.
All right, thanks.
And on the banks of the San Sebastian River, behind the Asado restaurant, you'll find a monument that's placed there. It's a relief map with numbers on it that correspond to the stories of the shrimping industry in St. Augustine. From its location behind Asado, you can look down the river and see these areas and see the bends of the river and get a layout of how St. Augustine looked back during the heyday of the shrimping industry. I really want to thank you guys for taking your time to watch the video. If you haven't done it yet, click on that subscribe link, give us a thumbs up. Most of all, hey, we want you guys to stay safe out there.